How have we got ourselves into this situation, and why was this? Tell us about this material, and when was it used, and was it presumed safe at the time, or was it building on the cheap?
Okay, so it was first used from the 60s through to the late 80s, possibly into the early 90s. Um, Building in the cheap, it was a relatively cheap product by comparison with normal reinforced concrete. It's much lighter weight, so you could make savings on the structure needed to support it, time savings because it's easier to install, and had all the hopes of being a useful material. But by the early 90s, and certainly by 1996, concerns were being expressed about its performance. It wasn't necessarily working quite as well as one had hoped, and there were some instances of the planks, which can be up to about 6 meters long, bending or deflecting quite substantially, and various durability concerns. It's a very lightweight material, about the third of the density of normal concrete. So there were concerns about durability. The general feeling for that period of time was that they would not fail suddenly. You would have some warning. There would be evidence of disrepair, of cracking or spalling, and indeed a number of panels did demonstrate cracking transversely on the underside. So you would know when things were deteriorating and action would be needed. However, when we get to 2018, there was unfortunately a sudden collapse of a roof at a school in Kent. And the investigations that followed that actually changed the thinking somewhat, because it was found that the reinforcement at the bearing ends of the panels, that's the ends that are actually supported, was either misplaced or defective, or may have corroded, I'm not sure which in that particular case, which could lead to a sudden failure. And the difference is that sudden failure wouldn't necessarily be preempted by signs of disturbance or damage.
Right. And sorry, carry on.
Well, I think since then there have been various investigations undertaken. Loughborough University and the Institution of Structural Engineers have been working on this problem and gathering evidence. They published an interim report in 2022. And I think research is still continuing to get a better body of data to base decisions upon.
And so, Trevor, obviously the danger that's in front of people, as you say, that there's not the kind of giveaway signs that something's about to sort of fall off or failure. It looks like it will happen quite suddenly. And how, in terms of your sort of looking around and knowledge of building, how frequently used was this material? Was it just in schools? Is it in other buildings? Is this scandal and this worry going to sort of move into many other buildings, hospitals, other public buildings, courts, that kind of thing? How worried should we be about that?
No, well, that's a good question. It's not confined to schools, for starters. They certainly were used extensively in schools. Well, I say extensively, I think probably a little bit of perspective needed, because out of about, 21,000 schools in England, we're looking currently at about 156. So that is actually quite a small percentage. But nevertheless, for those affected, it's significant. So schools primarily, or quite often, but hospitals, healthcare buildings, civic buildings, and to a certain extent, ambulance stations, that kind of thing. We've heard of Magistrates Court, and we've heard of Harrow Crown Court just recently as well, which was affected. These were buildings that tended to be designed or where the Department of Public Works, or later the PSA, was involved. It's quite common for them to use it. It's not confined, though, to public buildings, and I have come across it, although rarely, in other private developments, such as shopping centres in a limited fashion, and in a few cases office buildings. But in my experience, it's quite rare to find it in those buildings.
And what about residential dwellings?
I've never found it, or I'm not aware of it, as in widespread use in residential dwellings. One can never say never, but in my experience, it would be unusual to find it there.
Two questions before I want to bring Emma in, and do stay on the line, Trevor. Now, another investigation by the Sunday Times recently discovered that there's also a lot of asbestos in schools as well. How many problems do you think we're going to have with schools? Because you've got this concrete problem, you've got the asbestos problem. You know, how difficult is this all going to be to sort out?
Well, I think the asbestos we've known about for a long time, and schools and building owners and operators will have developed their asbestos management plans. So repairs and alterations in these buildings is quite commonplace. Precautions are made where necessary. The material is removed or made safe. So I think that's all capable of being dealt with in normal construction, in normal techniques. So I don't necessarily see this as confounding the problem significantly. Certainly, it's a cost that has to be dealt with, but the duty is to manage the situation, and that doesn't necessarily mean pulling out asbestos just for the sake of it, just because it exists. It does mean making it safe and encapsulating it, for example, so that it can't cause fibre loss. But yes, it's a consideration, but not anything more than we sort of familiar with.
Many people, the sort of big question they want to know is, how easy is it to fix this, to remedy this? Does this mean sort of pulling down buildings and rebuilding them? Can they be patched up? How quick a fix can this be?
Okay, well, the mere existence of RAAC doesn't necessarily mean that the building's going to fail or need to be torn down and replaced. That's the first point. Discovering it means that you need to carry out some very careful investigations to determine its condition. But it is possible to carry out certain work, such as providing in additional supports or reducing the span of the existing panels. There are measures that can be done. The panels are, another way to look at it is that they are a component of a building, albeit a structural component. But they are nonetheless a component, and components can generally be removed and replaced if necessary. So
it's not like the whole building has to get sort of pulled down. It can be fixed.
I think it depends on the context.
Okay.
But generally speaking, it wouldn't necessarily mean the end of that building.